Hello, everyone, and welcome to Artistic Spirit. I am your guest host, MJ Coppola, and we have a super special guest. You may know her if you're a regular listener. She is my friend and co creator, and also the host of Artistic Spirit. Not me. She's Katie Moran. Hi, Katie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for coming. For those of you who may not be familiar, Katie is an author, a poet, speaker, creative coach, and advocate. She is the social impact CEO of Tea and Tie, co-founder of Empower Us Poetry Press, and has authored multiple books, including her latest poetry compilation, Our Dharma, which is out now. So you should go check it out. Yes. She is the visionary behind several empowerment and mental health community platforms such as Rentiki and our Heartfelt Creatives. Uh, Katie's mission is to reach as many people as possible in a profound and uplifting way, and her impact is nothing short of incredible. I can personally attest to her ability to be a guiding force for so many, as well as her compassion and creativity. Such a joy to work with. So without further ado, Katie Moran.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here. This is to kick off the new season of Artistic Spirit, and we have so many amazing guests this year, so I can't wait to announce those and have you see them.
So many amazing people have been on this podcast. I'm so honored to be guest host. So when I was coming up with questions, I was thinking about all the things we talk about on a normal basis and what some of the most impactful things were. And one of the phrases that comes up like almost every conversation is this concept of invisible impact. And I love hearing you talk about this. So would you explain what it is and like give us an example?
Absolutely. So I talk about this in a very, I would say, unimportant way, but it comes from things that have been very important in my life. So usually when I talk about it, it's very casual in a way that people talk about, oh yeah, I keep posting and no one responds. And I always talk about this idea of invisible impact, and people might see your posts and not respond. And the very like inconsequential situation where I see this is I'll see people in person and they'll say to me like, "Oh yeah, your posts are so impactful. They're so empowering. Like the way you use social media is the way people should be using social media." And it's great. It's great that I get that feedback, but I also think to myself, this person has never liked a post. This person has never commented on a post. This person has never messaged me. I wouldn't even know they were following me if I had to guess. And that's the kind of like inconsequential way. So people see what you're doing, even if they're not engaging with you. And kind of like the deeper way that I talk about it is when I was in grad school, a teacher of mine brought in this human trafficking survivor, and she was talking about the people who impacted her. And when she had a baby, because she was being trafficked, they wouldn't touch her, and they did not touch her at all during her labor. And I was shocked to hear that, but she was so unemotional. She also talked about being beaten with, I think it was a bat, and she had no emotion at all about this. And I think, that other side of invisible impact is when we harm people and we forget about it, or it doesn't seem to be a big deal to us, but it goes on to change their lives. And then I talked to her about, was there anyone who helped you? And she started to cry. And she said, I remember every face. I don't know their names, but I remember every face of everyone who helped me get out of that situation or who showed me compassion during it.
Mm.
And I was so impacted by that because I think to myself, like, I thought of all the people that impacted me positively, and the good always outweighs the bad, and I think a lot of people don't acknowledge that, and the good moves you more than the bad does. And I think we don't recognize that as a society, that it means so much when you can tell someone the impact they had on you. And I like to kind of focus on the good side of things about spreading uplifting messages, and maybe people don't say anything about them or don't acknowledge them, but it's the right thing to do. And that's kind of like the deeper side of it. And also the other side of the coin, that sometimes you can impact people negatively, and that the good always outweighs the bad. And I think that's so important to recognize, because a lot of people look to the pessimistic side and they don't acknowledge how good the good is, and that the good will always outweigh the bad when you put it next to each other.
Yeah, I think of so many times in customer service where I was having a bad day, or, I was working and, you just get the people who are also having a bad day and they come in and they kind of like rub you the wrong way or whatever. But then there's so many times where I was having a bad day and there'd be somebody that come in and, you know, put their hand on my hand and be like, "You're doing such a good job," or like, "I really appreciate you being here," or whatever. And it not that it detracts at all from, like, someone's bad behavior, because it's still not okay, right? But there is this moment where you're like, "Okay, faith in humanity restored." Like, you have this like, "Okay, it's not all bad." And, I really do feel that, um,
Yeah,
that
actually,
light
the
radiating.
way I talk about it, and this is actually something the characters in one of my books do that is unpublished, but it's called squaring it. And it comes from this chi-squared formula. And basically, I had this stats professor who made us like hand calculate chi-squared, and I was like, this is so bizarre, like we're never gonna have to hand calculate this. And basically all the positives and negatives in the equation added up to zero. And we all did that, and we were all kind of like, it's zero, like that doesn't make sense, and that's not what the computer says. And he was like, it's because you have to square it. And I thought that was so interesting. So when you square it, the positives are positives and the negatives become positives. And I always say that that was probably the thing that taught me the most about life, is that you can make the things that are positive in your life mean more. And when you celebrate them, and when you have that be a memory that lasts forever, and you square the negatives by, and this goes back to my book, this idea that no pain is wasted, that you use your pain, you overcome your pain, and you use it to help other people. And that really is what the concept of our dharma is, because I think about this idea that of how much I've overcome and been through, and how I used to blame myself, and I used to be like, what did I do to deserve this? Like, how is this my karma? And I recognized, when I did some more soul searching, that it seemed like it was more of my dharma, and that I was taking on all this pain to help other people. Not to say people should take on pain to help other people, but I think if the pain is unavoidable, it's your choice to square it.
That's wow, that's powerful. Coming from something that's like, you can learn from so many different things, right? Like, it's crazy. And I know, like, we often have conversations about reframing, like, our thought patterns in the creative and the mental health space, as you and me especially. Like, for example, how writing has helped your mental health and your creativity, and in turn helped you, like, reframe your life in, like, the most incredible ways. What advice would you likely give someone at the beginning of their, like, reframing or their healing journey?
Um, Honestly, I think it's like too early for advice for people. Like, I think that that's when they have to decide what's right for them. And a lot of my content, and this is a very strange and abstract idea that I feel like has always been true for me in my content, is that I don't tell people what to do and I don't give people advice. What I do is either ask a question so people can see what other people do and they can choose what's right for them, whatever's calling to them, and I share from my own experience. And I always tell myself that good content shows you who a person is, and great content shows you who you are.
Mm,
And when someone looks at my story or hears something I speak about and they immediately come back with their own story or it made them think of in their own life, that's what's great in my opinion, because I think that's what stories are about. If they don't tell you who you are from your own introspection, from hearing someone else's journey, or you don't see yourself in someone else's story, then I don't think that that is an impactful story to hear, or at least not impactful enough for you to change your own life with what you have. And I love this idea. Again, it goes back to invisible impact, is that it's almost like the objective is that you are invisible. And that when people hear your story, they don't think about you, they think about how it impacted them and it becomes their story. And something I always say is that when you impact people, your impact doesn't belong to you, it belongs to them. And it can be very very bizarre to have this feeling of putting so much of yourself out there, but knowing that it's not really about you, it's about the people who let it touch their heart.
mm. That kind of reminds me of one of the things that I'm working on right now with the workshop that you know about. Um, how like sharing your art and how it's at some point in your creative process, like very similar to my process when I was creating my first book. Like I'd been a writer for like as long as I can remember, right? And finally at some point, and it was one of the things that you were like, at some point you just gotta like I don't remember exactly what you said, but I was like, just gotta let go. I gotta let go of
Mm.
it. It's not mine anymore. And it's that process of realizing at some point that like you created it so somebody else could find the impact in it or not, right? Um, and letting go could be really hard sometimes, I think. Um, but yeah, I think asking the right, not even the right questions, but asking the questions instead of giving a statement sometimes can be the most impactful way, having someone come to their own self, basically.
Yeah, and I think that that's what it really comes down to, is that you can't come at helping people as a way to save them, and you can't see what you do as healing people, which I think a lot of people get wrong. You have to let your own healing be the catalyst for someone to see that it's possible for them to heal.
Yeah. I think of how many times when I was younger, that people would tell me like how to fix my life. And I'm like, that's cool. But most of the time, I never did that. But I've had so many wonderful mentors in the last, like, especially in the last like 10 years, that like thinking back of like what the most important things were them asking me, so now what? Like, okay, you feel this way, either why do you feel that way, or they're asking the questions to dig deeper. Uh, and and that's but you can't dig for someone else. They have to dig themselves, right? And it's almost like giving them their own shovel to figure it out, to take
Mm.
off the crap that's on the top, the onion, as we like to say.
Yeah, and I think a part of it is like you dig in your space and you kind of like dig fertilized soil and you like shove it over to them and they can choose to plant something with it.
Right. Well, that's a good analogy. I like that. Yeah. There's there's a saying like in the healing space, it's like what you want wants you.
Mhm.
It's kind of like we kind of talk about it a little bit how like if you dream it, you can have it kind of thing. In simpler terms, like there's so much more to it than that. But can speaking of like digging, can you share a time you thought I want this and like now, like years later or whatever, like now you have that thing and like what did that look like as an emotional journey? Like if it was a roadmap, like what do you think that journey would look like emotionally?
Yeah, so I would say a few things, and I want to touch on these different topics that come up. So this idea of I used to tell myself that I felt like I couldn't pull myself out there fully and I had to wait because I had to wait for my skin to clear. And that was blemishes and things like that. And I would always wear makeup. And I even said something about like, oh yeah, this is like the first like family vacation where like my skin's like completely clear. And my uncle was like, "What do you mean? Like, I don't remember you like ever having a pimple." And I was like, "It's because I used to wear like a ton of makeup." And also like I was so insecure about that, so insecure. And a lot of my breakouts were from the medication I was on, and I didn't have breakouts before I was on medication. And yeah, I just started using this like Thayer's product and it cleared up my skin and it became a part of like my self-care routine and it was really empowering. And I remember thinking to myself that there's no real difference between when I was having breakouts and when my skin was clear, but it meant so much to me because I had told myself I had to wait to live my life until my skin was clear. And this goes back to this idea I talk about all the time is that we always tell ourselves there's a better time than now to create. And I think a lot of people can probably relate to this idea that like they have to hide when they have a pimple or I think it's something that is like commonly we feel insecure about. And I just want to say like like I didn't have clear skin until I started showing up the same as if I had a pimple and I didn't have a pimple. And I think that it seems so small and just so like elementary, but it's so important that it comes to this deeper idea that you don't have to wait for anything to live your life and you don't have to wait to create. And I pursued a grad school and I was in grad school and I was stuck in an abusive relationship. And there was this night where I thought I was going to die and I just had one regret. And that one regret was that I didn't write. Like my whole life was before me and I said to myself like if this is it, that's that's what I felt like I did wrong. I didn't write. Like I've had these story ideas and I never wrote them down. I never shared them and that was like such a deep regret and I can't describe what that feeling feels like and I was changed. I left that relationship. I started writing and yeah, like my whole entire life changed. I had a mental health relapse and that's when I had to be hospitalized and it was just so devastating the experience and I slowly became who I was again and I had to learn that. I had to learn who I was and build it day by day. So I committed to writing a poem a week for a year, so 52 weeks. I called it Summation 52, and to hold myself accountable, I put it on a website I would post every Monday, and I did that for a year. And my whole idea behind that was I wanted to learn how to hold myself accountable as a writer because I had taken a year off to write and I wrote one chapter in that time and it was half of a chapter, but it was a good half chapter. I'll say that. But yeah, it was just so empowering to be like, I said I was going to do this and I did it. And I talk about this is something that comes up a lot, creative self-worth. And that creative self-worth isn't about the quality of your work. It's about saying you're going to create at a certain time and doing that and trusting yourself that when you say you're going to do something, you do it. And it really isn't about quality. You can have the worst quality work and still have creative self-worth if you trust yourself to do what you say you're going to do. And also, the funny thing is the more you do that, the better your work gets. Um, so that's a big part of it. And I think a lot of the times people are like, oh, this person is such a great artist. But then you look at them and they have such low self-worth, such low creative self-worth because they create at intervals where they feel inspired and then they don't create anything and they just feel so down in the dumps about themselves. And yeah, it's a lot of context to basically say this idea that you can't wait. So after I started doing that, I started featuring poets on that website. I self-publish books, and I had this near-death experience where I choked on steak, and it was this really like horrible experience. And I was choking for like 4 minutes. I had to be Heimlicked, and there was a point where I was like, I'm going to die. And when that happened, I said to myself, I have no regrets. This sense of peace washed over me, and I was like, there's no regrets. I did exactly what I was here to do. And when I survived that, I said that's how I want to feel when it is my time to go, and that's how I want to help other people feel, is to live a life without regrets. And a life without regrets is really just living your purpose.
Hmm. That's so, yeah. That story, the story about the steak always gets me. Like every time. Like it's crazy to me. It kind of not necessarily that part, but what you said kind of reminds me of and I don't remember who said it, but I remember seeing it. It's from a movie, and this guy is talking to this younger man, and he says, you don't get confidence before you do the thing. You do the thing and then you get the confidence. And the young boy is like, well, that's dumb. He goes, that's how it is. And it's crazy, like how much that lives rent free in my head a little bit. Because every time like something comes up and I feel just if it, kind of like ugh, or whatever, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. You got to do the thing first. Get the confidence from doing the thing that you don't want to do or don't feel like it's the right time to do, and then you slowly gain this confidence. And especially in the creative space, I love telling people this story about how I only created from the dark space for the longest time because my poetry was an outlet for all the yuck that I have experienced in my life. And it was life-saving by all accounts. But it was not consistent. And I really was in a point where I wanted to put my artwork out there, but I was afraid to put my poetry and my writing out there. Um, and I didn't feel very consistent about it. And I really wanted to transform my poetry. And you had said to me, like, I'm I'm going to give you homework, and your homework is for the next week. I want you to write from a good mood. I want you to write from a lighter space. And I was like, I can't do that. Like, what do you mean? And then I did it, and I was like, oh crap, I could actually do this. Like it was great. And while my poetry does still come from a dark space, like some of it does, I found through that exercise of you giving me homework and being like, I challenge you to do it. And and I did it, and I was like, oh, I can actually do it. I can actually like do the things. The other lesson that you had taught me, it was that it doesn't always have to be great poetry. Like I don't have to show up and just be like, this. Like I made it a point to get a notebook, and I just, whenever I found like a phrase that I liked or whatever, I just write it down, and I make it a point to have a space where I create every day. And that doesn't mean, and this was how what I learned from you, that it doesn't have to be output all the time. You could be input. Like I can study a poet that I really like, and that could be like my sacred, like, creative time. And it did such a number for my confidence as a creator, that I started to actually show up saying that I was a writer for the first time in decades. Like I had been writing since I was like 6, 7 years. Like I have stories that my mom had like saved from when I was a kid, you know? Like I loved writing. And this was the first time that I had called myself a writer. And it just goes to, like, it just reminds me of like going back to, like, we had talked about community earlier today, and how important community was for that process, because I could show up to this safe space of also writers and artists and say, like, I'm feeling this sort of way today, and like, I just want to share my poem with you guys, because like I wasn't confident enough at the time to feel like put it out there into the content space of like social media. And that did numbers for me as well. Like community was just like so important for that as well.
Yeah, and
So
that's a great example of invisible impact because when I think in the time that we had those conversations, every time I suggested something, every time I was like I kind of like gave you a bit of insight that I could see from the outside, you're like, no, that's not for me. That's you're like, I can't do that. So I left those conversations like, that was a miss. And then like, some of those things you didn't share with me the impact until years later. And I think about that all the time because if I had again intertwined my self-worth with whether or not people thought I was right, I would have given up.
yeah. And that leads me to another thing too, how God, I don't remember it exactly, but it had something to do, and I remember we had either the conversation or had seen it on one of your posts about creativity and purpose. And it kind of leads back to that of what you were just saying about how you didn't link your self-worth with outside sources, more or less. Like your the self-worth part of your creativity and other things are linked to more internal yourself type of things.
Yeah, actually, I think I do talk about this in the anthology and this idea going like like deep diving a lot deeper into this. That no matter how I feel about myself, I just think my characters demand to be alive. And like when I was suicidal and I had my suicide attempts, the characters inside of me demanded to be alive. And I said that's not happening. And I would wake up the next morning from taking pills and stuff and I would just be like, how am I still here? And I felt no sense of like life in me. I felt so numb, and that's part of that's in my book Our Dharma. Um and I felt so numb, and those characters were just so alive. And I always say that I think that I lived not because I had to, but because that there were these stories inside me that demanded to be told. And I think for any creative, I do have this feeling, and I'm not sure if it's true. I haven't really investigated this that much, but I just have this feeling that for every creative, fulfillment means creating. And that fulfillment is always going to be difficult if they're not creating. And I don't think you have to be recognized for it. I really don't. I think it's in the creating, it's in giving life to the characters that live inside of you that makes you alive. And every time I touch my manuscript, I think to myself that this makes me come alive in a way that living doesn't.
Mm.
And I think that that is really such an important thing to talk about, because so much of the time I think we feel dead inside as creatives and heartfelt creatives in a cold world. And so much of the solution is inside of us, and it's what keeps us going. I heard I think it's Valerie Santiago, one of my mindset coaches. She quoted this the other day. She said, God didn't grant you another day to live because you needed it. He granted you another day to live because someone needed you.
That's powerful. That's seriously powerful. The weird that okay. So I know how much you love Stephen King.
That's an
And
episode there.
so I for better or for worse, I one of my favorite things he's ever done, besides teaching us how to write, is the Dark Tower series. And his Dark Tower series, in that one of the books, well, few of the books, he actually shows up as a character in those books. And the one of the most impactful, I mean, there's so many lessons in that series, but one of the things that I really took away from that is that in the book and outside of the book, he talks about how that story was like in him, and that like he wrote the first one and he put it away, and then had to like eventually it bubbled up so much so that like he had to create the other ones. And it kind of talks about it like in the series as well as like outside of the series. And I think about that. I think about how I I have this short story that I've been literally writing since I was in high school. And it's about this character Sky, and she's a young adult, and she's, just trying to navigate the world, in a world where like, her caregivers aren't, you know, super great at caregiving. And either way, like, this story kind of goes from there, her learning her lessons like from other places besides her parents or her caregivers. And I'm like, I've been trying to write that story for so long, and I think about Stephen King and how long it took him to write, like, The Dark Tower, and then you saying that, and I was like, "Yeah, maybe I'm still here because I haven't written that yet," and then you think about the invisible impact, like, what kind of impact would that have? I back in high school, little story time, I wrote a series of poems and in my creative writing class. And this last year, one of the women that I went to high school with, now I live in a completely different state that I went to high school. I don't talk to anybody that I went to high school, not because I don't like them, just it just happens like I grew apart from them. She found me on Facebook and she DM'd me and said, to this day, I still remember every word to the poem, and she recited it to me. And this was like 2 months ago. And I was like, how incredibly crazy. Like, not to give away my age, but I am 42 years old. This woman has remembered that poem for 20 something years. And that's crazy to me. Like, that something that I wrote had such impact that someone remembered it. Like, and it's not published. It's not a poem that's published. It's a poem that I wrote, and it died, but more or less. It clearly didn't, but you know what I mean?
Mhm.
That's the kind of like that's the invisible. And I'm almost guaranteeing like most people have a story about how they didn't realize how impactful something that they did, and sometimes if we're not paying attention, we don't get those cues from people always. But man,
Yeah. The quick way to answer that, because not everyone will have a story or be able to think of a way they've impacted someone that they didn't realize how profound it was. Everyone has a story about not telling someone about the way they profoundly
Mm,
impacted them. And I think that's the best way to like kind of like prove that, is because people will be like, oh, I have endless stories. Like it's like, yeah, like that book I read that like I don't even know who the author is. Like I'm not gonna email the author. Like I'm not gonna write a review. And I think it's so important that we don't even like think about us, but we think about those people we never told how much of an impact they had on us. And that could be your mother, that could be an author that you don't even know, you don't even know where they live, or their story. You just know this quote from their book, and there's no context, but it means so much to you. And I think about that all the time, and I think about how normalized it is to be
mm.
changed by someone and to never tell them.
Yeah. I have so many stories of, like, so many stories I could probably say. There is one story. I was sitting next to my, boyfriend at the time, and I was watching him scroll through social media, and he'd stop at something, laugh, comment on how awesome it was or whatever, and then he would continue, and I was like, "I don't think that's how you're supposed to work social media, like, are don't you like it? Like, can you interact with it? Like, how do you not do that?" But and maybe that's due to for me, maybe that's because I know, because we have these conversations about invisible impact all the time, that I'm more aware, and maybe that's how, like you said, maybe that's the better, or not better, but that's the more impactful approach, is to be like, how many times have you appreciated something and just not done anything about it? And it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be big, right? It could be the social media thing where you're like, "Ah," like, I heart on the comment section, like, "Hey, this is really cool," and then,
And
that's
it's
it.
easy for us to pinpoint like the opposite situation where we've impacted someone, or like the proof of it, because we have been talking about this as a concept for so long.
Mm,
So like we see it like with through like our glasses of the world. And I think it's important that people, when they're first starting out, they might not understand, like they might not even honestly like have the confidence to be like, oh, I impacted this person. And also like it's just so common for people not to tell anyone how they've been impacted by them.
mm. Which brings up another concept of, like, continuing. Even, like, it's so hard, I think we've talked about this too, is continuing on your journey, whatever that looks like, whether it's trying to create art more, or trying to be a little bit more joyful in your life, or just less feeling like crap. But either way, it's thinking like how you could have some kind of impact somewhere, to continue on. There are so many times cannot even tell you how many times, like, I'd just sit down and be like, I don't even know why am I here? Like, what is this? But, especially after we've had the conversations and I've been in the community, and, I think, okay, well, I'm just gonna write today, or I'm just gonna just just do just stay for, like, watch a movie. We talk about it in Rentiki, or you do
Hmm.
talk about it in Rentiki. Um, and you're right with the perspective. It's like putting on those glasses and finally being able to, like, notice every once in a while. Like, it starts off slow. That's what I've noticed when I'm trying to notice things. It starts off slow, like, oh, I could have probably said thank you to that, or said how awesome that was, or, whatever.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
I think it's a part of living. And I do want to be clear that for artists, like you're not gonna like like for artists who have ever been suicidal, you're not gonna like write your books and like die the next day. Cause I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah.
Like that's not the right way to think about it. Like the more you write, the more inspiration there is. And there's a big part of book publishing that has nothing to do with the book that happens after it, and it's the work after it. And I think when you follow your heart and you're changed through writing a book that means so much to you, you become a different person on the other end of it. And that person is a person that lives to serve. And there will always be purpose in serving, and there will always be reasons to serve, and there will be paths to serve. And that is something that I think the spirit does eternally, and it can give us purpose until we have a natural death.
Yeah. To continue, which brings back, the more that you do, the more that you are confident in what you do.
Mhm.
Practice makes better.
Yeah, and if there's one message I want people to really take away from this, it's that you don't have to wait to create,
Mm,
and that there's no better time than now. And if you feel like you want to wait until you're happy, if you feel like you want to wait until you feel a sense of purpose, again, like don't wait. Like that will come in doing and creating. And when you go to a manuscript that makes you feel alive, or when you go to something that matters so much to you, that is what changes you, and that is what turns you into the person that you dream about.
indeed.
Thanks for
Yes.
having me on today.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. Over your space.